Okay, so we're gonna
here?
start, and I'm sure that more people are gonna join. A few more people accepted, but I want to thank Jessica Melman for being here. I don't think she needs an introduction for this crowd, but just in case, Jessica Melman is the Chief Planning Officer of our Federation, and she does an amazing job keeping ears to the ground and being in touch with all of our local agencies and their needs for our community. During COVID, Jessica, I don't think she slept for about 6 months. She did an incredible job with her entire team of making sure that they knew what our agencies needed. And today, Jessica's going to give a little bit of an overview on some funding opportunities. So I just want to back up before Jessica starts and thank the Innovations Fund for being here and joining GRC in this meeting. We really are taking your thoughts into consideration. The grant review after this meeting, basically we'll send out another survey monkey and find out based on Jessica's recommendations today, what your interests are. And then the grant review committee is going to meet one more time and make final allocations. But really your consideration is really being taken into the larger picture. And Jessica's going to give a little bit of background also on the survey monkey that you all filled out already, and the top categories, and that's why she's talking about specific topics today. So I'm going to throw it over to Jessica and really thank you for joining us.
So hi everybody. We've got Hollywood squares, Brady Brent squares, so this is good. And we'll make this a conversation more than a presentation since there's so few of us. Before I get started with what I wanted to show everybody, I just wanted to remind everybody. So when you guys were asked to rank categories of your interests, the top two were food insecurity and elder care, followed by disability services, mental health, then Jewish education, and then Jewish summer camps. Right, Yafa, I got that right? Right, okay. So I'm gonna give you guys some data. Back in May and June, Federation participated with Brandeis University on a study called the Building Resilient Jewish Community Study, or otherwise known as the COVID-19 study. Brandeis was very interested in understanding what the response of the Jewish community was to the current situation. And we got some very interesting data back. I'm going to share it with you. And as I'm going through some of this top line data, I'd like you all to just keep in mind these categories and how this data can help inform the decisions that you're all making around how to spend our money, all right? And this will become a little bit clearer as we go through. So I am going to share my screen. I never know for sure if this is gonna work. Did that work? Do you see? Okay.
Yep.
Let's do a slideshow, beginning. All right, so this survey, again, was done May 21st through June 12th. We were one of 10 federations that participated with Brandeis in this survey. So in addition to having local data, we have some really interesting national numbers as well that I'll sprinkle in between here. There were some instances where, so you see our survey respondents were 1,400 people. There's just some areas that's not a big enough sample size to be able to say, this is what a particular topic looks like. So we have to rely on the national numbers, but we have some excellent local data as well. Another important thing to note here is that unlike our community study that's coming up, this was not a random sample of our community. Everybody who participated in the study was pulled from a list, either from Federation or one of our agencies or synagogues. So you have to infer that those individuals are already somewhat connected to our community. They're on a list, they're a member somewhere, so that just tells you something about the individual. All right, I'm going to start with talking about the economics. So the top line here is that if you were financially unstable prior to COVID, you were hit harder during this emergency. And for many of those individuals who were just teetering on the cusp of financial instability, this pandemic has pushed them over the edge. Nationally, and this is interesting, that we know this cohort of individuals, the financially unstable individuals, they don't fit the typical profile of somebody that we would think of as lower socioeconomic. Large percentage of these individuals are well educated with advanced degrees. And please, if you have any questions, I'm only seeing my share screen, so if you have any questions, please unmute and ask the question.
So Jessica, a few people just joined us, so I just want to back up for a second and just mention that Jessica's sharing a study that I mentioned in the email, a study that Brandeis did in our community, and we're going to use the information to help make decisions for the GRC funding. So that's why she's explaining.
Right. Okay, so a few things based on age. So sticking with the economics here, that younger adults definitely were shown to be not as financially well off than older adults, and much more worried about their finances. So you see age 35 to 49, much more of them were somewhat or very worried. Surprisingly, while 54% is still a high number, those in the 75 plus age category, and those are seniors who we usually think of as being economically insecure once they get to that age, or more economically insecure, only 54% said that they were somewhat or very worried, which was somewhat of a surprising number. And I think here was a big revelation. I think at this point, a lot of people have heard this statistic already, but a few weeks ago, when we just started talking about it, it was eye-opening to us. At the beginning of the pandemic, the community was really focused on our elderly population and the effects of isolation. We were very, very concerned that those who already experienced social isolation would become even more socially isolated and therefore have more mental health concerns. And while we are definitely seeing an increase in mental health concerns in those 75 and over, we were really surprised to find that it was the younger respondents that had the most trouble coping with the psychological effects of the pandemic. And this is despite having the greatest amount of social support. So older adults reported lower social support networks, but also lower mental health concerns, whereas younger adults said, I have a really good social support network. I talk to people every day. I feel like I have close friends, but their numbers were very high in social isolation, mental health concerns. One other piece is tying this back to the economics. Respondents who were worse off financially prior to the pandemic had a harder time coping with the challenges related to the crisis. So if you were more economically insecure, you were more likely to be having mental health concerns as well. Okay, I want to do a little bit about Jewish engagement and online programming. So online Jewish life really had the greatest appeal for those who were engaged in Jewish life prior to the pandemic. If you were engaged in the community before this started, you engaged in online Jewish life, and it really served as a critical link to maintaining your connections to the Jewish community. The numbers here were, if you fell along engagement lines, if you were not as engaged in community, if you were not as engaged pre-pandemic, you did not engage in virtual programming. The one interesting number we saw here on a national basis is there was a little bit of a blip for those who were economically insecure pre-COVID. They were more likely to engage in online programming, and we think that's because these programs were free. Whereas before you had to be a member of a community center or a synagogue to participate, this lowered economic barriers. Just a few more things to think about with online engagement. So older adults participated the most in online services, where younger people tended to use social media. And I really think that this says that we should not be afraid to introduce technology to older adults. They really embrace it and they really use it. And another interesting thing here is that, when we talk to our agencies, when we talk to synagogues, everybody says, you know, we reached out to all of our members. Everybody got contacted, but according to the study, 28% of individuals said that they were not contacted. And perception here is reality. In the world of marketing, we know, you know, somebody needs to see something, I don't know, like 10 times or 7 times before the message starts to sink in. And I think it's the same with connecting to people. You need to reach out to them several times and before they really feel connected. The synagogue numbers were very, very similar to the online program participation. If you attended services frequently, you were more likely to attend services online and vice versa. Congregants who were more religiously involved in Jewish life prior to the pandemic were more likely to receive all types of contact from their synagogue and were more likely to participate in that online programming. The last slide I want to share with everybody is really, you know, what we know about the effects of this online intervention. So we did a pretty good job, or we did a really good job connecting people to programs of those who connected, but we didn't really crack the code in connecting people to other people. And this is really linked to that mental health conversation. Those who participated, who had high participation rates in online programming, were more likely to say that being Jewish helped them cope and with the crisis, and that it made them feel even more Jewish. Their connection to Judaism and their connection to the community increased. We know from the national numbers as well that if people were engaged in this online programming, they expect to continue virtual programming even after the world opened back up again when the crisis is over. And this really gives us something to think about when we're talking about how we move our programming forward. You know, how do we incorporate this online programming into what we do when the world opens back up again? So I'm gonna stop sharing, and right, I will. I can absolutely share the PowerPoint. I'm also, if you give me one moment, I'm going to give everybody a link to the actual study. And you can read, that was really just the highlights. Give me just one second, here we go. Okay, so here is the full study. It's a lot of information. I mean, I had to read it 5 or 6 times before things started really sinking in. But if you're a data nerd like me, it's really interesting data. I think one other important thing to note here, and this is where this data really is important for when you're thinking about grant making and how we work with our agency, is a lot of the stuff, when you think about it, is kind of like, well, duh. You know, if you were financially unstable beforehand, you're going to be harder hit. That just seems intuitive. And it's one thing to make programmatic decisions based on your gut or based on anecdotal information. It's another thing to make funding and programming decisions based on the data. If agencies are going to start moving programs around, if they're going to start investing money in a certain program or a certain population, having the data to back up that decision is really important, because it's not just based on a gut feeling. Questions?
Jessica?
Yes.
So how does this translate to our agencies? I understand, to best I can, the survey, but I want to know, like, what agencies are affected by this? Because I think that's what we're looking for.
Right. So, you know, we know that if you're thinking about mental health, and we did this presentation to all of our agencies, execs and presidents, and they are absorbing, and they all now have the full survey as well and are kind of taking it apart. But we also know, and like, for instance, both JFS Central has said this very much corroborates what they're seeing, because they are getting calls from that 18 to 34 range in numbers that they've never seen before. We also know that, and again, like we highlighted that the mental health concerns are younger generation, but there are concerns with the older generation for sure. The numbers actually say that, and our JFSs can talk to that as well. I think for all of our agencies, you know, our Jewish community centers, Federation for sure, we've been putting out a lot of virtual programs, and we're getting pretty good feedback on them. And yet at the same time, we're learning that we're doing a good job connecting the people to our agencies, but people are really hungering for face-to-face, for people-to-people. And if we do go back into lockdown when the weather gets cold, what does that mean? Like, what do we want to push our agencies to do? Understanding now that that people-to-people contact is directly related to those mental health numbers. And do we push our agencies to come up with creative ways to connect people to people? That's what I've been mulling around in my head. We also know, and I think that like I believe food insecurity was number 1 on here, right? So the report will show you that people's needs were met. There were very few respondents that said, I was not able to get food, right? And remember, May, June, people were still like using Instacart and were afraid to go to the grocery store, right? And very few people said my needs weren't met. However, we also know, and we can't discount this data, that the rate of need that we're seeing at our food pantries is threefold, if not more, right? Like that is skyrocketing. So we know that our agencies are getting stretched. They're able to meet the needs, but they're really being stretched. And it doesn't take much to cause that stretch. Like if you're serving, and I'm making these numbers up, if you're serving 20 people and all of a sudden you have to serve 30 people, your resources are really going to be stretched. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing an influx of individuals who are suddenly becoming food insecure. And you saw that, you know, we know that people from the survey, this pandemic tipped them over, where they may not have had problems putting food on their table prior to the pandemic. Now they're having problems, and they need that food.
Jessica, can you give a concrete example of how the GRC can help? So I just want to back up, I guess, a step. So the grant review committee made the decision that all of the money that's going out is for COVID emergency, right? And it's all going to be funneled through the emergency allocation team. So like Jessica and the team that she's working with will help make sure that it goes to where this group, where GRC is directing it. So Jessica, can you, for food insecurity, for example, can you give us like what monthly they're asking for, that this might be a really good place for the group to put some of the dollars?
So with Jewish Family Service of Central New Jersey, that's the agency that has our kosher food pantry. JFS Metro West has a grocery food card program. I'll look at the food pantry for now. We have given anywhere between $10,000 a month to $4,000 a month, depending on their need. We're not the only funder that's funding them. I know they just got a wonderful grant from the New Jersey Pandemic Relief Fund that will hold them over for a month or so. But I think when we're looking at these dollars, money to help support the food pantry is going to go a long way. You know, again, we're coming up on colder weather where people aren't going to be able to go out, and they're going to need that food pantry support for sure. Another piece here, which I think is important to remember, is there's other food programs other than the food pantry. So for instance, the Kosher Meals on Wheels has been a lifeline for our seniors, and both of our JFS and then the Metro West the Metro West Kosher Meals on Wheels program is run through the JCC Metro West in conjunction with Daughters of Israel. They both had to add people onto their roles at the start of the pandemic because people became homebound. Seniors became homebound because of this. In addition, the YMYWHA and Union had a congregate meal site. There were seniors that came every day for lunch, and they relied on that lunch, right? It helped to keep them healthy. Nobody's having congregate senior programs right now. It's not safe for seniors to come together, and the Y made the decision that while these individuals may not have qualified for Meals on Wheels, they were going to make sure that their seniors continue to get fed, and they are delivering meals to every senior in their senior program. We've been helping with that as well. So when you're talking about food security, you really have to think beyond just the socioeconomic. This is hitting a lot of people.
Jessica, this is Ken Rosenberg. Hi.
Hi.
I just have a question. Individuals who have food insecurity needs, are these individuals that we're serving are individuals who are kosher and therefore need specifically services from our federation, or are these individuals who also can obtain assistance either through being directed or by us or contacting organizations like
Right.
Community Food Bank or something like that?
So I can tell you that,
efforts.
right, so I can tell you that the JFS Central, their food bank, if there's and that they are a kosher food bank, if there is an individual that comes to that agency, they have a reciprocal relationship with the New Jersey Food Bank. There's an individual who comes that does not need kosher food, they send them to the New Jersey Food Bank, and vice versa. So the majority of individuals, and it's the same with the Meals on Wheels program is a kosher Meals on Wheels program. You qualify if you need kosher food. If not, you get put on the county program, which is not kosher food. So yes, the individuals being served by our programs are those individuals who need kosher food.
Jessica, just to, the program that I think it was the USDA was running.
Yep.
And they were handing out meals to by JEC in Elizabeth, right?
Mm-hmm. But it was open to all of, it wasn't just for Union County, it was for all of.
Right, it was open. There were actually people from Morris County, just to the point of kosher. So this was, organized, this was government funds, but our community helped run it, and it was kosher food. And there are people from Morris County who were going all the way to Elizabeth to pick up meals. Mm-hmm. And this was a Wednesday mornings.
It's still extended. Now it's Wednesday night.
And now we're doing it through December, right?
And I mean, it's really one of the most amazing things that we do. It's not our money, but it's our people's time overseeing this. But to the point of, these are kosher meals. And yes, there are some people who come there, people wait in line in their cars. And there's two things there. One, I would tell you that, there are some people there who clearly, this is not kosher, but they're not going to kick them out of the line. And two, there are people there who you would not think would be there 6 months ago.
Right.
And which goes to one of Jessica's points earlier on.
Right. And I think this isn't one of the things I covered in the slide presentation, but if you look in the regular report, there's questions around job security, job instability. We all know people who have been furloughed. In my conversations with our Jewish Vocational Services that has career counseling, they have seen a boom of individuals who are attending their bi-monthly job search workshops, meaning how do you brush up on your resume, how do you brush up on your interviewing skills, but they don't yet have a boom, and there was over 150 people in their last job seekers seminar. But they don't yet have people that are actively searching for a job. So what they know from talking to people is that there are a whole lot of people who have been furloughed, whose hours have been cut back, but they're not yet ready to say, I'm definitely looking for a job. They're waiting to see if things get better, and they get brought back from furlough. If and when those jobs truly disappear, we're gonna see a whole other issue there. But these individuals whose hours have been cut back, who have been furloughed, like those are the people who are using the USDA food lines. It's enough food for breakfast and lunch for every child in your family, and it's helping to make ends meet while people need it.
Hey, Jessica, it's Bill Cohen. How are you?
Bill. Good, thanks.
So I found the survey super useful, and I had a question, and it's somewhat intuitive, right? I mean, if you're not engaged previously, you weren't engaged going forward. So my question to you is, are we, as part of the plan, to make sure that we're reaching out to those that are in our universe but haven't been engaged? Because it seems like, there's a lot more people that are struggling. And it seemed, I think half the respondents sort of said, that weren't engaged. I worry about those a lot because they're the ones that probably are suffering but are not raising their hand.
Right. And if you think a little bit further beyond that, we also know that the individuals who took the survey are more engaged in general because they exist on a list, right? So for the community survey, we're doing a list by, and that's going to get us to the people who don't exist on a list somewhere, right? Like they're not members of a synagogue, they don't belong to a JCC, they don't give to Federation. Like there are those people in this community. These people are engaged in some way, shape, or form, and we see that even among those engaged, there's not as much participation. Bill, you're asking the $64,000 question, or whatever that game show was. Finding those people and figuring out how to engage them was the question pre-COVID, and it's even bigger now. And I do think that there's something around engaging people face to face. Like, how do we give people an experience so that they feel more connected to other people? I don't know what that looks like, but I would love to be able to challenge our agencies to think that way, understanding also that all of our agencies are feeling extraordinarily stressed right now. They've all furloughed employees. They're all working on, they're all working on reduced staff, and yet engaging people and making sure that they have membership when the world opens back up again is super important. So I don't know that I fully answered your question, other than it's a really good question.
I just want to make sure we're aware, that we may just be helping a subset of our constituency. And, I just, and I don't have a solution, but I think as we think of how we're going to respond, we always want to make sure we respond to those that raise their hand. But I think half the people in the survey didn't raise their hand.
Right.
So Bill, let me just add, so Jessica and I have talked about this in terms of next year's bigger funding through the UAC. We'll have some preliminary data from the community survey by like January, February. So if we know there are whole pockets of communities that we're missing, we'll at least know that by early next year. And that doesn't solve the COVID issue. I mean, that's not a short-term solution, but long-term solution. If there are big pockets, we need to figure out innovations fund, UAC allocations. How are we going to respond to these, hopefully, I mean, perhaps pockets of that we don't know about.
Right.
Or we might find out that we are really well represented. We just don't know. And there hasn't been a community survey like this done in like 20 years. So but we're starting that process.
Bill, also
2 years ago, but we did.
Right, Bill, I would also just respond, and I think you're right. I think we always have to be thinking about those who are not engaged and how do we help those who may not have raised their hand. But I think it's super important to remember that this virtual programming and this virtual engagement was a lifeline for a large segment of the population. It kept them engaged. It helped them deal with a crisis. It brought them closer to community. And without that programming, those mental health numbers could have been a whole heck of a lot worse than what we're seeing. So I think it's important to remember that.
Bill, from my perspective, the three things about this survey that I think are really important. One, putting in perspective, it was 2 months into this pandemic, and the world is, forget all the fatigue stuff, but we're now starting to see the job impacts of PPP stuff wearing off as like literally tomorrow. Major companies. The second thing is, we can't stress it enough. These are people who were already connected somehow, right? So, let's assume there's 100 and something thousand Jewish people in our greater Metro West area. you know, the Federation list is 10,000 long, right?
Yep.
Synagogues membership is certainly less than 50%. You know, so we know that there's a huge population that is not connected. You know, the one number that keeps coming back to me is that 28% of the people who said that nobody contacted them. To me, that's the opportunity, right? It's the opportunity to say, okay, there were even people who connected somehow that did not get contact. And I think we have to know the people or connect with the people we already have a connection with. And then we have to go to the other half, but it's the right question.
Right, and I'll add, when the survey said connected, it wasn't just a call to find out how you were doing. It was a call to find out how you were doing, an invitation to a program, a solicitation for funds, and still 28% of the people said they were never contacted. So,
I think surveys, maybe the survey going forward is an easy way for us to, as a separate topic, just understand that aspect of the community that we don't reach,
yeah.
You know, separately. But I take all your points, and I think, you know, the programming is fantastic. The marginal cost of getting, you know, an additional 1,000 people, I don't know, probably is pretty limited. So if we can do that, that would be great. But I think the, you know, the connectivity and what you've done so far has been great.
So I'd love to bring everybody back to your rankings and your categories. And Yafa, please tell me if you want to take over this part, but I'll just reiterate the way that things were ranked with you guys previously, or before I got everybody on Zoom. It was food insecurity, elder care, disability services, mental health, Jewish education, and Jewish summer camp. And you know, I think all of those, through the emergency response team, we've actually dealt with all of those issues in some way, shape, or form. Maybe Jewish summer camp a little bit less. And there are needs in all of those areas for sure. And I think if you'll forgive me, I mean, I'll talk about disability services just very quickly, because this was something that the COVID study, the sample size was just too small to be able to deal with that cohort of the population. But I can tell you that there are 3 organizations dedicated to disability services in our community: JSDD, JESB, and JBS. And there are phenomenal programs for individuals with disabilities at all 3 of our community centers. And of course, our JFSs deal with individuals with disabilities all the time. And we know that this is a population that's taking a hit at the state level. Funding for disability services have been decreased. Our agencies are really struggling to get their day programs back open again. They're investing money in their infrastructure in order to make those programs safe for the individuals to come back. And at the same time, disability services, basically Medicaid, there's been cuts to those those reimbursement rates to the agencies. So those agencies dealing with that population, they're struggling. So.
Yeah, but can I ask you a process question?
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
Is the goal when the grant review committee meets next week, or whenever you said it was, you're going to come together with like, these are 10 ideas of things we could fund, or these are 10 programs our agencies could use funding for, or how are you planning to?
So Jessica and I have been speaking, you know, and GRC, we've had part of the conversation. We know that we're going to allocate through the emergency, like through the committee that you sit on as well, right? I know you sit with Jessica. And we're going to, we have, so the grant review committee has specific funds, and there's purposes for those funds that are donor intent. So some of them are very specific. So for example, we have $36,000 for FY21 that has to be spent for elder care, for all different like things having to do with elder care, but it basically needs to go to those categories. We had $20,000 that was already allocated that had to go for education. And then there's this $100,000 that the way that they move the money around from the innovations fund can more broadly go to Greater Metro West, whatever the grant review committee deems is appropriate use of that money. So we're looking at $136,000 that the grant review committee needs to allocate. And we know it's going to be through the emergency allocations team. But in terms of reporting that grant review committee needs to get, we need to give some direction. So we've been working with part of this conversation, and all the conversations I've been having with Jessica are that the group will meet in a few weeks. And I think based on this conversation is really divvy up categories instead of agencies. I think it's going to be too specific to go just give to JFS food pantry. So the group will decide also, you know, along with another Survey Monkey, maybe they want 30% of the GRC funds available for COVID funding to go for food insecurity. And then your team, when you meet, will know that you have this extra funding available in that category, you know, and so on and so forth. So elder care, we know you need to spend $36,000 on it, but that can also be for food insecurity for elder care, or it could be for another program that you deem is necessary unless the GRC wants to up the number of dollars in the elder care category. So it's really going to be like a division of the dollars in overlying categories, and then making sure through like the reporting you get, Jessica will be in touch with the grant review committee and come back and say, this is how the dollars were spent.
I also wanted to add though, the part that we have that comes from funds, I think we have a responsibility to carry out the wishes of the people who've given us those funds. So we have that certain amount of money that we're going to have to say it's designated for elder care, it's designated for disabilities. So those we will follow through, and then the rest of the monies we'll be able to make our choice about.
Yes.
Right, does that make sense, Jonathan? In past years, this has been like an open application where organizations applied within different categories for a set amount of dollars, and then the group decided who receives the grant based on an application. And this year instead, it's a completely different COVID-related process.
Great buckets.
And if it helps the group to know, the emergency relief committee, which I also sit on with Jonathan, you know, we are actually thinking about, you know, the end of the pot, right? I mean, this is not an endless pot. So, you know, you should know that this is a meaningful and a very impactful contribution to those emergency relief dollars.
Absolutely.
And just from the timing, you know, it's,
Perfect.
you know,
We're running out of
we
time.
refill this too many times, right?
Yeah, this is actually perfect timing.
Right, and one of the reasons we waited until now, the group met in June and Jessica said, no, this is a marathon, not a sprint. Those were Jessica's exact words to the grant review committee. And that's why we're having this conversation now in September. And so it's been really helpful.
Yeah.
Any other questions for Jessica? So if more questions come up, we will send them at you. And, you know, I'm going to have another conversation with Jessica before we create some sort of Survey Monkey that we're going to send out to the group who joined us today, you know, to get your feedback before the next grant review committee meeting. Really feel free to give me a call offline. I know Jessica's available as well, or you can just come to Springfield, New Jersey, you in the middle.
Right.
But really, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. And really, thank you, Jessica, for walking us through the study and giving concrete examples.
If you decide to read through the full study and you have any questions or want to talk about any of those numbers, I'm happy to discuss further with anybody. So thank you all. Have a wonderful Sukkot.
I'll send out the survey and the copy of the PowerPoint in an email as a follow-up.
Okay, thanks everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.
Take care.
Thanks, Samaya.
Thanks, Samaya.